Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm a 2L at UND Law, and I'm also a member of Law Review. And today it's my privilege to introduce to you Morgan Griffith. Morgan Griffith is of counsel with Steptoe and Johnson. She received her Juris Doctorate degree from West Virginia University, and like her other speakers, she focuses primarily in energy law. Ms. Griffith has broad experience in coal, oil, and gas, broad experience in coal, oil, and gas acquisitions in large real estate transactions with clients. This includes drafting transactional documents for mineral transactions, clearing title for horizontal wells, assisting joint venture groups acquiring capital and gas rights, and reviewing leases, providing curative action to clear title, and to perform due diligence for clients acquiring or leasing acreage. Today she will be discussing the contrast in coal and mineral rights law between North Dakota and her area of practice in Appalachia. Many of the issues in coal law mirror the upcoming issues North Dakota faces in oil and gas litigation, and we appreciate her input. Please welcome Morgan Griffith. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How are you all? I am the only person standing between you and happy hour, and I realize this, trust me. And I was telling my dad that I was going to come up here and do this presentation. We live in West Virginia. And I told him I was going to come up here and do this presentation. And he just said, remember that brevity is the soul of wit. And I don't even know what that meant, but I'm going to take from it, if I am quick, you guys will be happier and I'll be more popular, right? Right. This presentation I've given several times, and I've given it, in West Virginia and comparing Pennsylvania law. I've given it West Virginia comparing Ohio law, West Virginia comparing, let me see what else, maybe Virginia law, but I've never given it in a Midwest state, comparing and contrasting coal and the treatment of in North Dakota versus West Virginia. So it was a learning process for me too. It was really interesting, and I picked up a few new facts. So hopefully I learned a lot about your state, maybe you'll learn some about my state, and we'll all learn about coal in general. This, like I said, presentation is a really broad overview, and each slide that we can talk about is really worthy of its own book. You know, you could write a book on each one of these slides. But I hope that you enjoy this presentation, that when you're in the oil and gas business, that you think about coal, because it does play a role, and that you learn something interesting and maybe get a few laughs out of this. So I'm going to get started before all my papers fall off. Game. Give rise to some things that we're going to talk about during our next hour together. All right, let's get started. Here we are. This is a really cool slide. And I got this on, let's see, when did I leave to come here? I came here Tuesday. So my friend texted me this picture on Monday. And this is the Pittsburgh, downtown Pittsburgh. And she is standing in a building called EQT, which is a production company. It's an exploration and production company for oil and gas. And there's a huge march by environmentalists in Pittsburgh. So they're going to invade, the environmentalists are going to invade the downtown Pittsburgh. Well, I live in West Virginia, and in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, coal is king, and we don't mess with coal. And so Consolidated Coal Company is the largest coal company in West Virginia. And Consol took one of their barges out and said to the environmentalists who are, in the downtown, in the biggest letters you can imagine on an entire barge, "Welcome to coal country." And that's how we do it in West Virginia. So anyway, I thought that was a lot of fun. Very relevant. Okay, this is what we're going to talk about. First of all, we're going to start off our talk talking about what is coal. We're going to talk about fossil fuel formation. We'll define coal. We'll give a history of coal in North Dakota and West Virginia. I'll do a general overview of West Virginia coal beds, and then we'll talk about North Dakota coal beds, and then we'll get into why we care about coal. And we're going to talk about the overlap of the Marcellus and, say, like the Pittsburgh seams of coal, and we'll talk about the Williston Basin and the Bakken shale. We're going to care about coal because we have safety concerns, and we're going to care about coal because we want a permit to drill our oil and gas wells. And then lastly, we'll talk about politics and maybe the future of coal. All right. Coal is not the remains of dead dinosaurs. This picture is Evan Griffith, and Evan Griffith is my youngest son. I have 4 children, and he is the 4th. He was 4 years old when this picture was taken. He just turned 5. But anyway, I have always wanted my kids to think I'm a cool mom. I mean, that's kind of a big deal to me. Like, I want to be that cool parent. And so when I very first started practicing law, I did workers' comp, and the facts kind of lent themselves to excitement. You know, the guy got run over by a bulldozer, or, you know, the guy hooked his meter readers up to 1,000 volt, and his meter readers only read up to 250, and, you know, he electrocuted himself. I mean, these were good stories. And then after I started doing workers' comp, I went to work at an oil and gas company. I worked at EQT. And that was, you know, fun in and of itself. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been out on an oil rig or an oil and gas rig, and, you know, the pads that they make are 5 acres. There's heavy construction everywhere. Everybody in my office wore, you know, fire retardant clothing, and so, you know, we were like glow-in-the-dark people, and, you know, like I say, there's big equipment everywhere, and my kids thought I was so cool. And then I left and went to Steptoe and Johnson. My job moved to Pittsburgh, and I stayed in Charleston. And it's not a cool job. So my children may think that I work with the remains of dinosaurs, and that's okay. You know, I'm not going to dissuade them of that notion that they may have. But anyway, we know, you and I know, not the Griffith children, but you and I know that coal is not the remains of dead dinosaurs, because coal began forming about 300, 400 million years ago, and the dinosaurs came around between 250 and 65 million years ago. So coal's a little bit older than the dinosaurs. But that's going to be a secret that you and I are going to keep. All right, let's talk about fossil fuel formation. And this is kind of interesting too. To dumb it down for you all, it's like, well, why did one dinosaur become coal and the other dinosaur become like oil and gas? To back up, there are 3 fossil fuels. There is oil, gas, and coal, and these are non-renewable sources, as opposed to renewable sources like wind and water. There's always going to be wind and water, but there's not always going to be coal. Coal doesn't generate itself, and it takes millions and millions of years to make. So as we deplete it, it's just gone. The different types of fossil fuels, the different types of the oil and the gas and the coal, were formed depending on whether they were plant or animal life. And as this slide shows, coal was formed by plant matter. And so what would happen is you'd have these giant, you know, let's go back 300 million years ago when the earth was covered by oceans and swamps. And the plant material in the swamps would die, and they would, you know, lay down and form kind of mats in these swamps. And then, you know, new plants would grow, and then they would die, and then they would fall down, and then the rivers would flood, and all the sand and sediment would come in and wash away and cover the layer of the plant mats, and then, you know, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And so over time, these plant mats started to sink, and they get heavier and heavier, and as they sink further and further down, they're exposed to hotter temperatures, so the moisture evaporates, and you lose your pore space. And the weight keeps compacting it, and the hotter and hotter it gets, you get your first stage of coal, which is peat. And you keep on cooking it, and you keep on cooking it until you get your other stages, which I'll talk about in a minute. The oil and gas is a little bit different, because oil and gas is formed from oceans, and they were formed from like live animals. They are your dead fishies and your dead sea creatures, and that's the difference between oil and gas. Between coal and oil and gas. Coal is plants, and then oil and gas is formed by animals. So, and it's interesting to me that oil and gas are pretty much the same thing, only gas cooks longer. So your first stage is oil, but as it gets deeper and deeper and hotter and keeps cooking, it forms natural gas. Now, oil and gas have the tendency to migrate, so after they form, they want to rise, but they are stopped by the rocks. And so, you know, you have the migration into these giant reservoirs, but then these papers do not want to stay up here. So they migrate into these reservoirs, and they start to rise, but they're trapped by the rock, which is why you don't see generally oil and gas come to the surface. Okay, now we're going to talk about what is coal. What do we talk about when we talk about coal? Coal is a black rock that occurs in layers beneath the Earth's surface. It is the altered and compressed remains of plant material. It's composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. And because it was a living matter, when it was formed, when you burn it, it gives off energy. And so when it breaks down, because it had been alive once, it gives off energy. As we talked about a minute before, the factors that affect coal makeup are temperature, pressure, time, whether it was in fresh water or salt water, because that's going to affect your sulfur, the degree of swamp acidity, the types of plants, and the types and thickness of the sediment cover. Coal is divided into 5 categories. I actually have a little thing over here. Coal is divided into 5 categories or ranks, and I'll let you. The first rank is peat, and peat is, like brown. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about the history of coal in North Dakota, and I love the picture of the moose next to the coal burning power plant. I mean, that when I saw that, I thought that was so very perfect. Okay, long time ago, hundreds of years ago, Native Americans used lignite as pigment and as a grinding tool, and a little bit for fuel use, but not what you would expect. There's no woods in the plains. Like, you don't have the trees like we have on the East Coast. I mean, I live in the mountain state, and it's completely timber. We have a huge timber industry. And so the people used what was called the coal wood, or the lignite coal, to burn for heat. And coal is actually this lignite coal, your brown coal, is mentioned in the Lewis and Clark journals that they kept. So in 1804 and 1805, when they were over this way, they would talk about the brown coal or the coal wood and how useful it was to them on their expedition. In 1873 through 1900s, the prevalent mining method was called wagon mining. And this is where you take a pick and a shovel and some dynamite, and you go blow up like a drift or a seam of coal that rises to the surface, and you get enough after a day's work to probably fill your wagon, and you take that home. You really only needed about 10 wagon loads a year for personal consumption, like for you and your family, and so you could get all your fuel in like 2 or 3 days worth of work. And that's the way the coal industry kind of started in North Dakota. It was for personal consumption. There were small lignite mines, but they were kind of selling to their little communities, and it was for personal use, and it mostly came from the outcrops. Like I said before, the problem with lignite is you can't store it for very long, because once it's exposed to air, it kind of turns to dust, and that presented problems for shipping. In the 1900s and the 1920s, you started to get your underground mine. And this was where you take a slope mine or a slant mine. And so a slant mine it is what it is. I mean, it slants down into the earth, and then you walk along your coal seam. And you would do the room and pillar mining, which is where you'd have these giant pillars. So it's like a series of rectangles, almost like a checkerboard. So you take one coal pillar and then mine the one beside it. So that coal pillar would hold up the roof. And so you would kind of checker along and leave about half the coal underground in this room and pillar method. In 1907, you can tell that coal is starting to acquire some importance in North Dakota, because the North Dakota legislature requires licensing for the first time of its commercial coal mines. And in between 1908 and about 1945, you had 558 mines total in that time period. Now, the average mine only had about 10 workers, and the average lifespan of the mine was only about 6 years. These were slope mines, and each of these mines produced less than 10 short tons of coal a year. 10,000 short tons of coal per year, which isn't a whole bunch. Now, this isn't to say that every single mine in North Dakota was just like a little family-owned mine. They weren't. There were some larger ones. There was mines on the Mouse River in Minot. The Lehigh near Dickinson was a larger mine, and then the Washburn Lignite Coal Company, the number one mine, Mine 1, was the biggest mine in the state until it was replaced by the Washburn Lignite Coal Company, Mine number 2, which was very big. The UNWA, which is the United Mine Workers of America. The United Mine Workers of America started in Columbus, Ohio in 1890. And it was to combat the horrid and wretched conditions of these poor coal miners. The horrible hours, terrible pay, awful living conditions. So it started in Columbus, and in North Dakota, it had its first formation at the Wilton Mine number 2, and that was in 1917. And they just kind of came in, and you know, there wasn't a whole lot of opposition. The first thing that they did at the Wilton number 2 mine was to double the pay. So then, you know, by 1919, every mine is a union mine. And like I said, I couldn't find any information telling me that it was a big deal for them to enter in and come in. They participated, like, say there were 1,500 union workers in 1919. And there were national strikes. So the problems weren't in North Dakota, but they were nationally. And so the UMWA said, we're going to participate in these national strikes. Everybody that's a union member, no matter what state you're in, drop your pick, drop your shovel. We are going to strike. Well, the governor in the 1919 national strike stepped in, and this is Governor Frazier of North Dakota, and he met with the UMWA and then went and met with the operators and said, let's work something out. And so they got the UMWA to agree to a smaller salary raise, and that the North Dakota coal wouldn't be shipped out of North Dakota, which would help other states' operators because there would be coal available. And so I guess the UMWA was okay with it, but the coal operators were not. And they said, no, we're not doing that. And so they went on strike. And this strike lasted a whopping 5 days. And then, you know, they got back together and said, okay, we'll give you, instead of 60% increase in pay that you want, we'll give you the 14%. And it worked, and that was the end of it. And we move on to 1922. And there's another national strike. And I get the sense that people in North Dakota really didn't want to strike. I mean, you know, hey, we need coal to heat our homes and such. So, you know, but we're part of this union. We have to strike. So we struck. And it lasted 2 months in North Dakota. And, you know, North Dakota seems to be very quick to, like, patch things up and get things better. And so they anticipated that things were going to get much better nationally. So they went ahead and went back to work like 2 months before everybody else. And so that's kind of the way that I've interpreted the UMWA presence in North Dakota, which is, and I'll tell you in a minute, vastly different from the UMWA's presence in West Virginia. But moving along, I'll just tell you that the first steam-powered, like, strip mining, steam shovels, mechanicalized equipment started in 1922. And then by 1926, there were 3 mine sites that were using this strip mining with this mechanical shovel. And it contributed to 1/3 of the state's commercial tonnage for that year. So strip mining with machines really had a big impact. So by the 1920s, because you can't ship lignite, which I've now said 3 times, I think we've beaten this horse, but instead of it shipping out, industry came to it. And so you kind of see this rare occasion of all these power plants right alongside the coal mines. And so I think that within a 50-mile like radius strip, and there's a slide in a couple slides that I'll show you that has this, within a 50-mile strip east of or west of Bismarck, you'll see like 4 of the major strip surface mines, and then you'll see like 8 power plants right around them. In 1941, 25% of the lignite was dedicated to the electric power generation. And by 1943, there were 150,000 homes in North Dakota, and 85% of them were heated by coal. In 1945, for the first time ever, strip mining surpasses underground room and pillar work. And then after World War II, homes switched from using coal as the primary heating source to oil and gas, which is a little bit cleaner. So in 1950, 55% of the homes used coal. By 1960, only 23% of the homes in North Dakota were heating their homes with coal. And the mine numbers, of course, are affected by that. So they go from being like 102 mines to 47 mines during this time. By the 1960s, all coal, well, 90% of it, is being sold to the power plants. And then we'll talk about present time in just a few slides. But as you can see, the oil and gas industry has really had a big impact on coal. There are only four mines now operating in North Dakota, and they're all the surface mines, all the strip mines, and it's the Freedom Mine, the Knife River Mine, the B&I Mine at Center, and the Falkirk Mine. There are two like quasi mines. Geo Resources have one kind of like near Williston, but they're mining something called oxidized lignite. And I mean, what it is for agricultural purposes. I mean, they're not mining it for home heating or lignite coal as we're thinking of it. They're mining it for other purposes, for agricultural purposes, to put back into the soil. Now we get to a completely different beast, and this is the history of coal in West Virginia. And it's kind of amazing to me. Well, in West Virginia, we have woods, and wood has already, we've had such easy access to wood. Wood has always been the primary fuel source up until like the 1800s. And in the 1800s, coal kind of makes its appearance, and people start using coal, for personal consumption. And the first commercial coal mine opened in West Virginia near Wheeling, which is sort of near Morgantown, WVU, if any of y'all are football fans, or not football fans, because we have the worst football team this year. But anyway, in 1810, the first mine opened near Wheeling. And again, it was marketed locally, and it was a drift mine. So there's an outcrop, and they just kind of pick along the mine. They just kind of drift their way along the mine. By the early 1800s, coal replaces wood as the primary heating source. And then in the mid-1800s, you get your railroads, and you get the shipping of coal to larger markets. And because it's bituminous coal and not lignite coal, it ships well. So you can ship it all over the East Coast, which is what they did. In 1840s and 1860s, you see the emergence of coal companies. So it's not just like your little local mine or, you out with your little pick heating your own home. You're actually seeing the emergence of the big coal companies. And this is one of my favorite quotes because I just think it's so interesting. And it came from Thunder in the Mountains. It was written by Lon Savage, and it talks about the West Virginia mine wars. And anyway, it says that most homes and businesses were heated by coal. It was therefore always puzzling to observers that this essential commodity did not confer wealth and stability on the people and communities that drew their livelihood from coal. Far from it. Now, why would that be? The reasons are it's because coal was plentiful. I mean, we don't need to ship our coal to North Dakota because y'all have your own coal. So, everybody can kind of go out and get their own coal. Transportation out of West Virginia is expensive. It's kind of like you can't get there from here. This is the true story. I mean, it's very expensive to lay rail lines around the mountains and around the rivers, and so that was a factor in it. And the lowering of the coal, of the price of coal didn't increase demand. So you wouldn't be like, oh, yay, coal's on sale this week. 2 buckets for the price of one. I'm going to go out and buy 2. You bought it as you needed it. And so the lowering of the prices didn't do anything with the demand. So the only way to make a profit in the eastern Appalachian Basin in West Virginia was to lower wages, and that's what they did. And these poor miners lived in these just abysmal lives. Here's another quote. The town was entirely financed, built, and maintained by one mining company. So you had all these little coal mining towns surrounded by the company mine. And the town was laid out in a grid, and so everybody was like a 15-minute walk to the mine. And mines were shabbily built because they used the cheapest construction possible. The most common dwelling was a semi-detached house, and the architecture reflected the social stratification. So the poorest people lived down at the bottom, and as you went up the hill, you got your coal, like the store owners, the company store owners, and then the actual coal company owners. And the coal company store occupied the most prominent location in town. So I'll tell you just a little bit, since I've got a little bit of Melissa's time to kill. I'm kidding. I won't keep you out, I promise you. In Ohio, when the miners went on strike in Ohio, for example, they would bring in these immigrants to replace the striking workers. And the people from Ohio were nice to their replacements. I mean, they were nice to them. And when they were vindictive and committed like bad acts, they did it against the property. They'd burn tipples, or they'd burn the mines, or they'd tip over carts or do something like that. But they never really harmed the property. And really, and same in Pennsylvania. It's not that they harm the property because in Pennsylvania you're so close to D.C. and you're so close to Philadelphia that you have a lot more government involvement. And so, as soon as Rockefeller's mines are getting out of hand, man, the federal government's there to put things in the right. And so, you didn't have the issues that West Virginia has. So you have these poor creatures living in, let me see what the next slide is now. And this is in southern West Virginia, generally, is where you have these mine wars. So in response to the UMWA, these coal companies formed these organizations of, let's call them quote-unquote private detectives. And the worst private detective firm of all was called the Baldwin Phelps Organization. And essentially, it was a reaction to the UMWA trying to make an entrance into southern West Virginia. And if you went to a meeting, if you were thought to be organizing with the UMWA, if you were, any association with the UMWA, you were harassed, beaten, kicked out of your coal mining house, because the coal companies owned the houses in the coal towns. So you'd be evicted from your house. And so it didn't take great hold in West Virginia. And then in April of 1912, you have your first of 3 wars. And this was called the Paint Creek War. And I'm going to combine it with the second one, which is the Cabin Creek War too, because they were both one was 1912, one was 1913. But essentially, one mine was paying more than another mine was. And so they decided to unionize and go on strike and say, we're going to form this union, we want better wages. And, the operators called in the guards from the Baldwin Phelps, and in July of 1912, they had like a fight in the streets, and the miners attacked the mayor, and 12 miners died, 4 guards died, and it was kind of like war in the streets. So the governor Hatfield was sworn in, and he was quick to resolve the problem, and so there was a little bit of a period of peace until about 1920. And in 1920, there was a sheriff. I'm sure y'all have heard of the Hatfields and McCoys. I mean, I know I'm in North Dakota, but this is kind of like a feud that spans the United States, you think. And so anyway, the Sid was one of the Hatfields, and he is the police chief in the town. He is very close with the mayor. And the mayor and the sheriff, Sid, are pro-miner. I mean, they are, and this is atypical because, usually the people in power are mine-controlled, but these two are different. And they take pity on their neighbors and, the people that they're supposed to have a fiduciary duty to. And so they try to help them. Well, this doesn't go over well with the mine operators at all. And so in May 19th of 1920, these Baldwin Phelps detectives arrived in Matewan, West Virginia. And they began evicting people from their homes whom they heard were associating with the UMWA. And Sid Hatfield had it. I mean, this was enough. So he went to Welch, which is, a train ride away. He went to Welch and got warrants out for these men saying that they were unlawfully evicting people from their homes. And he came back and he served the warrants on the mine operator detectives and said, you guys are under arrest. You've illegally evicted these people. You can't do that. So there's a huge shootout, and 7 detectives die, 2 miners die, the mayor of the town is shot, he dies, and it's a big deal. And so Sid gets arrested because, essentially he's the one that caused this shootout to occur in the streets. Well, when that happens, the miners went nuts. And there's a strike, and they bring in strike breakers, and the immigrants that they bring in are called the strike breakers. So if you don't want to work, fine, we'll get him to work for you. Well, unlike Ohio, they are not nice to these people. I mean, they are harassed and literally run out of town. There's more evictions, there's more shootouts, and when people left their homes when they were evicted, they were finally like, you know what, fine, we'll go live in a tent. And so half of the southern part of West Virginia was living in tents. It was called Tent City. So Sid's trial comes up, and this is in August 1921. And so he goes to the McDowell County Courthouse to stand trial for killing these Baldwin Phelps detectives, and he's shot and killed by other bad guys, other detectives. And this was the last straw. I mean, so the miners poured out of McDowell, poured out of Lynn's Creek, and they started to march to Logan. And there's like 5,000 miners marching towards Logan. And, everyone is getting nervous. I mean, this is a big deal, and they all wore red bandanas. And that's where you get the term rednecks, because these guys in red bandanas are marching towards Logan. So the governor calls for federal troops, and the federal troops come in and they meet at Blair Mountain, and they actually bring planes in, federal, the whatever, Air Force planes, and drop bombs on the people in Blair Mountain. And so most of the miners surrendered at this point, and the strike kind of ends and fizzles out. But that's, and there are really tenuous hold between the UMWA and, the organized coal mine operators. And to this day, my office is in Charleston, West Virginia, which is the capital, and, all the rallies and the UMWA rallies are in Charleston against the coal operators, particularly, like, I don't know if you heard about the Patriot reorganization and then bankruptcy. I mean, Charleston's kind of a hotbed for this. Well, after the surrender, when the federal government came in and dropped bombs on, its own citizens, UMWA membership plummeted. Like, nobody really wanted to be part of this. And so it didn't ever really take hold in West Virginia until maybe like the 1930s, mid-1930s. And that was only when Congress had enacted the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this protected the rights of workers, it allowed for collective bargaining, and it outlawed the mine guard system, which was the Baldwin Phelps agency. And so the UMWA started to take hold in West Virginia after that. It was active in post-war strikes. It was helpful, very beneficial in getting welfare and retirement benefits like your black lung compensation. In 1969, there was the passage of the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, and it kind of standardized and improved mining practices. It gave the workers federal black lung benefits. And during this time here, I'll show you this. And this is a slide of kind of like the history of coal. So during this whole time that I've been talking about in North Dakota and in West Virginia, what happens is you see a shift from the drift mine, which is the line that goes straight across, which is where you follow the outseam crop along like the face of a mountain, to the slant mine, or the slope mine is what they're calling it, which is the one that has a little bit of an angle, so you walk into, and then you walk out towards the seam in the mountain, to the shaft mine, which is where you sink a shaft directly into the coal, a couple hundred feet, maybe even 800 feet below, and then mine the seams below, to strip or surface mining, which is the bulldozer at the top of the mountain taking off the top of the mountain. Literally, it's called mountaintop removal. And then lastly, you see this auger mining where they're kind of boring into the side of the hill with the auger. I think it's interesting that North Dakota has no underground coal mines anymore whatsoever. You only have the surface mine, or the strip mining. And West Virginia has more underground coal mines than it does have the mountaintop or the surface mines. Mountaintop removal is not very popular in West Virginia because essentially what you're doing is shaving off the top part of a mountain, all the rock and everything above it to get to your coal seam, and pushing it over the side of the hill and filling a valley. And so it's really kind of flattening the southern part of the state, but you have so very many issues with that because you have all kinds of water issues. And like I say, these valley fills, it is not the citizens' preferred method, to say the least. Okay. Do y'all have any questions so far? Well, I'll talk to you a little bit about the A Basin. And the A Basin is the Appalachian Basin. And the Appalachian Basin is divided into three parts. There's the northern, the central, and the southern. The southern's not in West Virginia. The southern's more like Tennessee and Kentucky. But West Virginia has two of the beds in the A Basin. There's the upper A Basin and then the central. And this is a picture of the Pittsburgh seam of coal. And I don't know if you can see the outline of West Virginia. It's right below the red. But the Pittsburgh is the top producing bed in West Virginia and in southern Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania by far. It's the second largest producing bed in the nation. It's the thickest and most extensive. It runs through Maryland, Ohio, a little bit of Pennsylvania, and the top portion of West Virginia. There were 34 billion tons of coal in the Pittsburgh bed. There's now about 16 remaining. And remember when we talked about it, like coal doesn't rejuvenate. Like when it's gone, it's gone. So now we're down to about 16 billion. The other beds that are popular in the northern A Basin are the upper Freeport and the lower Katanning. And then this is a general overview of the Appalachian Basin in the southern region. And these are West Virginia's southern coal fields. And so you can see it in the right-hand corner. There's a little picture of West Virginia, and the red part of it, that's the southern part of the state. And the top producing zones in the southern coal fields are the Pocahontas No. 3, the Fire Clay, and the Pond Creek. And here is your Williston Basin. And that's the one in the orange. And your big coal bed or your big coal source is the Fort Union Group. And in your Fort Union Group, it's the Bullion Creek Formation, and that's the Beulah Zap, the Hagel, but the most important are the Harmon and the Hanson seams. And as you can see, you see these little red squares and these little purple triangles. The little red squares are the surface mines, and then the purple triangles are all the power plants that have cropped up around them. Just to give you a brief overview, the first slide on the left shows where electricity comes from in 2010. And in 2010, coal was responsible for generating 48, almost 49% of electricity. And when I mean where does electricity come from, it essentially is the difference between natural gas power plants and coal burning power plants. And so what happens is you bring the coal to the power plant, the coal is burned to heat the water makes the steam turns the turbines, and then the turbines power the electric lines, and that's how you make electricity with coal. And so in just 2010, coal and coal-fired power plants are responsible for almost 49%. Natural gas has about 21%, and then nuclear has 19%, and then the others, the wind, water, and other renewables account for about, I don't know, maybe 10%, something like that. When you look just 2 years later at what has happened, coal is down to about 37%, and natural gas is up to about 30%. And so we're seeing a real switch in usage from coal-fired power plants to natural gas power plants. And I think it's only going to change from there. I think coal will go way down and natural gas will go way up. I'll talk to you a little bit about jobs. In West Virginia, there are 16,000, almost 17,000 underground surface mining jobs and 6,000 surface. In North Dakota, you have no underground mines, no underground jobs, and you employ about 1,100 people in the mines. Nationwide, about 91,000 people are employed directly by the coal mines. And when I say directly, I mean that are actually working down in the mines. And I'm not talking about the people that are like working at the coal handling facilities or the coal processing plants or the contractors or the people that are doing the shipping. I'm actually talking about miners themselves, about 91,000 people. In 2012, West Virginia produced 129 million short tons of coal, and its national rank is number 2. Wyoming's number 1. West Virginia produces the second most. In North Dakota, you guys are the 9th. You guys are the 9th largest producing coal state in the nation, and you produced about 30,000 tons or short tons of coal last year. In West Virginia, we have 42 coal-fired power plants. In North Dakota, you have 15 coal-fired power plants. In West Virginia, we have 538 mines right now currently. 292 of those are underground mines. In North Dakota, you have 4 mines total. And in West Virginia, our severance tax is almost $500 million. Last year, it was $490 million. And you, North Dakota, also have a severance tax. And essentially, a severance tax is the tax that you pay to the state when you remove coal from the ground. In West Virginia, it's 5%. And so it goes to the state, and the state keeps 93% of it, and it goes to fund all kinds of state projects and state roads and everything like that. North Dakota's is a little bit different. North Dakota's, I think, is a flat tax, and so for every ton of coal mined, you pay 37 cents, and then maybe another 2 cents for a lignite foundation or fund. And so like I say, West Virginia's severance tax, so the amount of money that coal companies paid to the state for the opportunity to deplete our coal resources was $490 million. Yours was in the area of $9 million, but your production's lower, so that makes sense. But it goes to good use. We do not have an oil and gas severance tax yet in West Virginia, although you can guarantee that that's coming down the pike. I'll tell you really quickly about why you should care about coal. I work in the oil and gas business, and you would think that this is an odd topic for me to present. But if you look at these two slides, if you look at the overlay of the Pittsburgh Seam, which is the first slide, versus the Marcellus Shale, which is a gas shale only. It is not an oil shale. It's only gas. And half of it is dry gas, and about the other half is wet gas. And by dry gas, I mean it's just purely methane. The wet gas has your other anes, like your ethane and your butane and your propane and all that other stuff. Wet gas is more popular at this time right now because those other anes you can sell. And so you're kind of getting like a 2-for-1 bonus. And with the price of gas being so low right now, it's not making a whole lot of sense to produce the dry gas out of the Marcellus. But anyway, you care about that because, like I say, they overlap. And so you can't get to the Marcellus without drilling through the Pittsburgh Seam of coal. You just can't get to it. And so you have to pay close attention to the play between the coal operators and the oil and gas operators. And the same thing in the Williston Basin. The orange represents the Williston Basin, and the Bakken is on the right side, which is, that brown kind of blob. There's also an outline of the Williston Basin on the second slide too. But they overlie each other. And right now, your oil fields are vastly more, I would say, important than your coal production at this time. But, with all kinds of new mining methods and things like that, it will come in a day of reckoning between the oil and gas, and I think it already has with your enactment of the Resource Coordination Act. Just to give you a quick, this is a stratigraphic column of the Pennsylvania Monongahela group of coal. And so the left side, you can see down at the bottom is where the Pittsburgh Seam of coal lies, and it's generally about 250 to 400 feet below the surface in the northern part of West Virginia. Contrasted with the other side, which is the kind of the oil and gas stratigraph, and the Marcellus is kind of right in the middle. It's a Devonian shale, and it's highlighted in yellow, but I don't know if you can see it. But the Marcellus lies between 6,000 and 8,000 feet below the surface in northern West Virginia, southern Pennsylvania. And here is a slide of the coal basin, that Fort Union group, which, as you can see, runs from about the surface to about 1,000 feet below the surface. Contrasted on the left side, which is your Bakken oil plays, which are, well, if you're in Canada, it's just a few thousand feet below the surface, but by the time you get into North Dakota, it's like 10,000 feet below the surface is where the Bakken lies. And the Bakken has three formations. There's like an upper, a middle, and a lower. And the middle one is where the operators are targeting their horizontal drilling. So the legs are trying to hit that middle shale. That's been the one that's been so greatly produced. In West Virginia, you care about coal because of safety. And these are two pictures of rigs, oil and gas rigs in West Virginia that have drilled through underground coal mines. And there's methane in these underground coal mines, and the methane explodes if you don't do it right. And so the first one took place in Moundsville, which again is near West Virginia University. AB Resources drilled through an abandoned Consol mine, and it ignited a pocket of methane gas and caused this explosion. And then the next picture on the right side actually is behind my in-laws' house. My in-laws live in Harrison County, West Virginia, which is near Clarksburg. And there's a big Marcellus well on the hill behind them. And so my kids and I used to walk up to the top of this hill, and I'd be like, ta-da, this is what Mom does. And they'd be like, Mom, you're so cool. Well, it blew up because they, again, drilled through this old abandoned mine, and there was methane. And this time people were actually hurt. 3 people were injured, and they had to be flown to the burn unit because there was methane gas contained in the coal seam. One thing that's cool about North Dakota is y'all don't have safety concerns as far as your coal goes. I read this article that says North Dakota coal mines score a perfect compliance record. I mean, I've never even heard of that. In West Virginia, there are so many citations, it's ridiculous. But anyway, you don't have safety issues when it comes to your coal. And actually, though, you have more workers die per year than any other state in the union. You rank 50th. And a lot of it has to do with the oil and gas rigs. Now, you're not drilling through underground coal mines. Your fatalities are resulting from like being hit or crushed or entangled or falling. You know, these booms are hundreds of feet high, and so you fall off the boom and you die. And the second reason is transportation. I mean, you know, you have to drive so many rigs and so many fracking trucks and so many water trucks to these sites, to these pads where you're putting your well, that there's a lot of transportation, and as a result, there's a lot of fatalities with the transportation. West Virginia is not a whole lot better when it comes to overall safety. Our state ranks 40th, but like I say, you all are kind of the leaders in fatalities. In West Virginia, you care about coal because you want a permit to drill your oil and gas well. And this is the statute for permitting. And it says it's unlawful for any person to commence any well work without securing a work permit. And the permit has to contain the name and address of every coal operator operating seams under the tract of land, the coal owner, and the lessee of record. And then it says before, so that's to get your permit. Now before you drill or frack a well, you have to have a plat prepared, and it has to be sent to every coal operator operating coal seams beneath the land. The only party in West Virginia that can hold up your drilling process is the coal operator. If you have the prettiest house on the prettiest mountain and somebody wants to come in and put a rig right behind your house or within 200 feet of it, too bad. It's going in. Now, you do get damages, but that's your only remedy is damages. The only holdup to get for your permit, like I say, in West Virginia is the coal operator. So you want to get along with your coal operators. That being the case, it doesn't rarely happen. Because in West Virginia, particularly in the northern part where the Marcellus wells are, you know, the vertical wells, when you sunk a vertical well, you didn't take up very much space at all. I mean, you know, we're talking not even, you know, probably 100 feet were disturbed. These Marcellus pads cover 5 acres, sometimes 7. They are huge, huge, you know, areas of development. And, you know, if you put a Marcellus pad in the middle of somebody's strip mine or surface mine, you have really affected their operations. So in West Virginia, when you can't get along with your coal operator, we actually have a spacing statute, and essentially when the coal owner operator and the oil and gas operator can't agree, there's mandatory spacing, and you can't put a well within, say, if it's the well's going to be deeper than 3,000 feet, which all Marcellus wells are deeper than 3,000 feet, you can't put a well within 1,500 feet of another well. This gives your coal operator room to come in and mine, longwall mine, do whatever it needs to do to get the coal out. North Dakota, you guys are very opposite. The only person really that can hold up your drilling permit is the surface owner. Under 3818.6, when you apply for a permit, you have to notify the surface owner that you're coming in on the land, and you have to get their signed consent. And if you don't get their signed consent, if you can't agree, you go to court. And you go to court, and generally, from my understanding of things, is that the oil operator is going to win, but there's going to be heavy damages paid to the surface owner. And so, you know, like I say, in West Virginia, we could give a flying hoot about the surface owners. And in North Dakota, you really need to pay attention to your surface owners. North Dakota has enacted a resolution of conflicts in subsurface mineral production, which is NDCC 3815-01 at SEC. And this is like, why can't we all just get along type thing? And it's lofty. You know, I have it here. And there's goals, and you know, it's the policy that we all get along and we all develop our minerals appropriately, but there's no meat to this statute at all. There's nothing that says how we're going to do that, and there's no case law interpreting. It's just kind of like, we need to do this. But you know, that's kind of the wave of the future. They enacted such a thing in Pennsylvania, the Oil and Gas Coordination Resources Act, and you know, it takes a while for these things to grow teeth and grow case law and figure out what that is, but it's there. So this is really my favorite part of this talk, and it's good because I only have like a couple of minutes left. And it's the politics. And I had so much fun learning about this when I started researching coal everywhere, because this is a national issue. This isn't particular to North Dakota or just West Virginia or Pennsylvania or, you know, the A Basin or the Williston Basin. I mean, it's world. So when we talk about Obama's war on coal, and that, you know, there are billboards every third mile in West Virginia about, you know, Obama and his war on coal. And, you know, you see him with shields and a sword, and you think, really? Like, what is this about? Is he actually, like, going to go to war? This is crazy. Well, when we talk about the war on coal, we're not actually talking about, you know, like picking up arms and President Obama going to war against coal. What we're talking about is his EPA. And the EPA is enacting policies which are very anti-coal coal production. And most of them they have to deal with the Clean Air Act. And the first one, there were two. One of them's called the Utility MACT, and one of them's called the Cross-State Air Pollution. And the Utility MACT, the MACT stands for Maximum Achievable Control Technology. And under the Clean Air Act, the EPA has to establish MACTs. So they have to establish maximum achievable levels for pollutants. And the Utility MACT generally deals with mercury. This is what we're talking about. Now before, there were these old coal-fired power plants. And these coal-fired power plants certainly didn't meet the emission standards, which came about in 1970 with the Clean Air Act. And so what happened is that they were grandfathered in. Like, you know, if you're going to build a new coal power plant after 1970, you got to follow these regulations. But for you old ones, we're going to allow you to proceed how you've been proceeding. Well, under the Utility MACT, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to end the grandfathering in. And so all these old coal mines are going to have to be brought to current and use the current technology with the current scrubbers and everything like that. And it was literally, I can't tell you how many coal-fired power plants in West Virginia out of business, almost all of them, because almost all the power plants in West Virginia are pre-1970. And so anyway, mercury, unlike carbon, I'm sure you've heard of carbon credits and carbon sequestration, mercury can't be traded. And so you can trade carbon credits, but you cannot trade mercury credits. And so if your mercury level is then it is that. So there was a case called White Stallion. And what happened is that Texas wanted to build a coal-fired power plant in Bay City, but they couldn't meet these new standards. Like, it was impossible to build this plant and meet these standards. And so anyway, essentially, they took the EPA to court. And when you go to court in these Utility MACT cases and in the cross-pollution cases, you go to court in D.C., in the D.C. Court of Appeals. And so it was interesting to me because an amicus brief was filed. And the amicus brief was not coal companies. It was refineries, chemical manufacturers, waste combustors, medical waste incinerators, paper plants, rubber plants, cement companies, wood council, the API. I mean, every major industry, it seemed, in the United States joined in this amicus saying, like, this has to be shot down. Like, we can't live by these regulations. And essentially, what the Utility MACT was going to do was, the way it is now, is if you're a factory, you look at like factories to determine the level of pollutants. And so if I am a steel factory, I look at other steel factories to see how they're doing. You know, what's my range here? And then within that steel factory, you look at the overall pollutants. And so, you know, you take 20, 30 pollutants and you look at the overall level and say, you know, this is okay. What the utility MAC proposes doing is looking at things like on an individual basis. So we're going to compare the steel industry with these really good results from this timber plant. And then we're going to compare on an item by item basis. And so essentially they cherry pick like the best results. Well, like this timber company had great results in carbon, and it's this, and this had great results in this, and so that should be the standard. And so they were literally like cherry picking standards that no one could meet. I mean, you know, in the greatest of all conditions, it was not attainable. And so that's the argument, is that it's not attainable, and that they're going to put all these companies out of business. So anyway, long story short, White Stallion is at the United States, D.C., for the District of Columbia Circuit. The rehearing in bank was denied in January of 2013. And essentially, I forgot to tell you the most important part. The DC has agreed that that this was too overbroad, that you can't do this. And so, like I say, now the EPA has petitioned for a hearing in bank, and I think that was shot down. No. The briefs are due. And actually, I think that they were due in March of 2013 for the EPA. So, I mean, we're another year from hearing this out. But it will be coming down the pike, and it will have a great effect. The next topic where Obama is, quote-unquote, waging war is this cross-state pollination. And this deals with sulfur and nitrogen oxide emissions. And essentially, you have good states and bad states. And there are 28 bad states, and then the rest, everybody else is good. And these 28 bad states are pretty much every state along the East Coast and Texas, and then everybody else is good. And what is happening is these upwind states are polluting the downwind states, the way that the wind currents carry. And so what they want these states to do is clean up their act, and by doing so, their neighbors will be cleaned up too. But the way that they went about doing this was making it so that the upwind states had a larger burden of cleaning up, because everybody had to be at the same level. Everybody had to be at level 10. These guys were at level 18. These guys were at level, 10. And so they would have to reduce it so much so that this neighbor couldn't be affected at all. And essentially the argument was, we have to get ours so much lower so that our neighbors stays low too, and that's not fair to us. And so the court agreed and said, yes, like this was too overbroad. You can't, and the case in which they said that was called EME Homer City Generation versus the EPA. And essentially, a bunch of companies sued over these emissions rulings. And the court held that the EPA has exceeded its jurisdiction under the Clean Air Act by imposing these massive emissions reductions on these 28 states. So we're going to send this back to the EPA. We're going to send this rule back to the EPA for them to work on. And meanwhile, the 1970 Clean Air Act is going to rule. So, like I say, the EPA appealed that. The Court of Appeals agreed. The rehearing in bank was denied. And then the Supreme Court, in June of 2013, granted certiorari. So we're going to hear this case, and the Supreme Court is going to decide how essentially it's going to be the first decision out of the Supreme Court for Obama's war on coal. And we'll see how his EPA stands. If the court affirms, I think we're in trouble. If the court, says, no, you've exceeded your jurisdiction, I think that we'll be in pretty good shape. And I think it'll set precedent for the way future cases and EPA rulings will be treated. It's the same thing with water. There's cases. There's one called National Mining Association versus Jackson, where the EPA has essentially, made rules that are much too strict, or in this case, actually made up a rule. And so it's not just limited to the Clean Air Act, it's also limited to the water. But like I say, it was really, really interesting learning about your state's law and comparing it with my state's law. And I am actually licensed to practice law in North Dakota, so when I say your state, I should say our state, but I guess I'm just a West Virginia girl. But thanks for having me, and if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be glad to ask them at this time. If not, well, I mean, I won't cut anybody off, but I do want to remind you, Steptoe and Johnson, where I work, is hosting a reception later this evening, and I hope that you all come and join us at this reception. There'll be drinks and food and such, and I think it'll be a good time and a time for us to talk and maybe get to know each other a little bit better. Plus, if you're in law school, if you turn down a free drink, you're crazy. I don't know anybody do that. Shoot, I'm going to. All right. Anyway, thanks, guys.